Welcome to The Technology Pill, a podcast that looks at how technology is reshaping our lives every day and exploring the different ways that governments and companies use tech to increase their power. My name is Gus Hossain, and I'm the Executive Director at Privacy International.
And I'm Caitlin, and I'm PI's Campaigns Coordinator. Hi.
It's actually quite nice today because we are recording this in a room, and so we apologize for the sound, but together. And we haven't done this together for a very long time, and it's nice to be able to do this.
I wired the sound, so we'll find out if it's nice.
So we're very fortunate today to have two fellow PI members of staff who are going to be coming in to talk about CrowdStrike. You may not remember the name of the company, but you may remember last summer, the summer of 2024, there was a day or two where it felt like every computer system on the planet was about to teeter over and fall, and many of them did. And at PI, we watched this with alarm and a little bit of amusement, and also trying to figure out what had gone wrong and what we can learn from it. So this edition of the podcast, we're going to explore with Tom, who's a lawyer, and Chris, who's one of our techies, to try to explain what happened, to wonder what we can do differently, and to get an impression as to whether this is the reality of things to come.
Hi, I'm Crystal Weatherhead. I'm Technology Lead at Privacy International.
Hi everyone, I'm Tom West. I'm a legal officer here at PI.
Okay, so what are we talking about is question number one.
So CrowdStrike refer to themselves as a threat intelligence company. What that kind of means in more layman's terms is they sort of do business to business level, like antivirus and cybersecurity related activities.
Last year in July, there was a bit of a problem when CrowdStrike tried to push an update, and it caused pretty widespread problems, I think it's fair to say. We put together a list for an article we wrote about it, and we had stuff from all around the world. We had banks, we had airlines, we had Waitrose, of all things, all going down, blue screens of death in Times Square, and it took out Windows machines around the world. And that was because they tried to up their Falcon sensor, which is?
The Falcon sensor is part of their cybersecurity suite. It does things like intrusion detection to work out whether something malicious is going on the system that it's running. And it does this by having a long list of definitions of what it considers to be malicious activity. If it detects malicious activity happening, then it flags it and lets the operators know is that something's going on and that this might need further investigation, basically.
I think what was interesting about this is that it was connected very deeply into Windows and Microsoft. So all of this kind of happened, even though probably no one had heard of CrowdStrike before then, but actually their systems were depending on their functionality.
So I remember when this story was happening in the media, and the first thing that everyone thought was happening was there was a massive Windows hack, because suddenly loads of Windows computers went offline. Like, what actually did happen?
They were running an update, and they did it wrong.
Yeah.
And so because that update went out automatically to all users, it got pushed onto all these devices.
It was 911 in 12 different states of America, 2 Belgian hospitals, which I think got back up and running on the same day. Tons of flights. Mercedes F1 team got affected, which is pretty funny because you could see it on telly on the pit wall with the blue screens of death. But the 911 is less funny. And I Googled it. And so in Alaska, both non-emergency and 911 calls went unanswered at multiple dispatch centers for 7 hours, which is terrifying.
Yeah, so CrowdStrikes have done their own post-mortem after this incident to work out, what went wrong and how did it go wrong. And the CrowdStrike Falcon has these definition updates that tell it about new kinds of malware. And these are done fairly frequently, daily usually, if not more frequently than that. But they actually have two different sort of strands to their update process. They have the definitions on one side, and they have kind of definitions but also program updates on the other side. And the program updates go through a slightly more extensive quality assurance process, whereas the definitions, because they're so regular and they're really only defining what the Falcon's looking for, they have a much lower threshold of what quality assurance is required. What happened here was what was essentially, to some extent, a feature update kind of went into their daily updates. So it didn't go through the full test suite that the feature update would have gone through. And then it got pushed, and it got pushed immediately live to all of these machines. It had some poor, malformed information in it, which when these machines tried to access this data, it didn't work correctly, which meant during their boot up process, they failed to boot.
Now, auto updates and security updates are super important, right? They are really, really crucial to how our devices work, keeping us all secure, making sure that companies that provide these devices and the software to us are keeping us safe. So we need to have those updates coming. They need to be done right. Some people, I think, were saying to this, auto updates are terrible. That's not the case. They are a good idea, but they need to be tested properly before they go live. And that maybe is where actually the problem arose, really.
We've always said that security updates shouldn't come at the deficit of feature updates. The CrowdStrike situation demonstrates the opposite as well, though. Like, you shouldn't try and bundle the two together either, because a feature update that causes failure down the road because of poor testing is just as catastrophic as forcing someone to take a feature to enable security.
Who's making the decision at an organization to have CrowdStrike as part of their infrastructure, and who therefore knows? I would imagine very few organizations understood that somewhere within their IT infrastructure and the relationships they have, they're contracting with a company called CrowdStrike. Like, how long does it take for somebody to figure out, if I'm the CEO of a bank, why is it everything's gone crashing down?
Some companies will obviously run everything in-house to some extent, and they will know. But then other operators may just outsource everything. And it's those people who will not necessarily know exactly what their technology stack is until something like this happens. And they're suddenly like, are we running CrowdStrike?
And I think not only were there people who were saying, are we running CrowdStrike? But it was running right into the kernel of the devices as well. So right to a particularly sensitive part.
Kernel is the
kernel.
Yeah.
Like a popcorn kernel, not
like a
Colonel
popcorn
Sanders.
kernel.
Yeah?
Not popcorn chicken. They're having KFC for dinner tonight, so I'm getting really mixed signals.
It's on your mind.
Yeah. But no, so it's that because of its central aspect in the system, it is also needs to be pretty secure. So running stuff within the kernel is, requires a level of authorization that is usually above that of most programs. But these packages, like CrowdStrike, want to run inside the kernel because they want to detect malicious behavior that's happening. And the easiest and most unfettered way of doing that is via the kernel.
Which is part of why the damage was so deep and so severe and widespread.
And my understanding, it's entirely the fault of lawyers why this happened, right? That the kernel was made accessible by Microsoft to third parties because of competition law and decisions around Microsoft being forced to open up access to its stack, essentially. Is that correct?
To some extent, that's true. So Microsoft started developing their own cybersecurity suite ages ago now. And third parties who had long offered cybersecurity solutions for Microsoft's operating systems were like, well, you're giving yourself different access than we're able to get And that's unfair. That's, your solution will always work better than ours because of the access that you're able to give to your solution versus the ones that we're developing.
Okay, so this didn't happen because Microsoft was forced to not be a monopoly. This didn't happen, as Tom rightly says, because, we shouldn't be issuing security updates that are so important. And it's not even because we let a variety of companies into the very depths of our operating systems. It's because a company had a bad process or a poor process. And we're able to say that because they have said as much. Is that fair?
But I think all these things that it wasn't a cyber attack. I think that's clear, right? We know that. But it does make us ask the questions, well, what if actually this pathway we're talking about, had been exploited for a cyber attack? We're talking about companies which have access to the kernel, to other parts of operating systems, companies which most people haven't heard of, being able to run those updates automatically. Well, does this open up the possibility that actually someone who was up to no good could exploit some of these possibilities in order to access your device, access your sensors? So it does give us pause for thought, I think, on some of those issues.
Well, I think what's interesting to me and what it reminds me of is we did a podcast about the XE hack, which was the Linux file compression system, which got compromised or very quickly found by slowly psychologically torturing the guy that maintained the project because it was open source. And it's a similar thing, at least to me, which is if you can compromise a system that other systems rely on down the chain, it's kind of a delivery mechanism that hasn't been looked at in the same way. And these companies are particularly interesting because they do the looking. So if you compromised one of these updates from CrowdStrike or whoever, then they do the threat assessment. They're not going to look for themselves.
I mean, that's part of why we want to see as much transparency as possible in how this is done, and why there's new requirements coming in under the EU Cyber Resilience Act to notify all these incidents and trying to make that as straightforward as possible. And that's absolutely part of the story, but it's not the whole story. And this takes you back to Gus blaming the lawyers on this point as well, because actually we don't think that necessarily locking it all down and saying only Microsoft has access to this and no one else allowed in is going to necessarily provide with a more stable and secure system and environment overall as well. And in fact, we think if you rely too much on individual companies, I mean, I go back again to what we're saying, the vast array of devices, businesses, services affected by this, because they're all running Microsoft. So we see these single points of failure, right? We see the fact that it is possible for when something goes down, everything goes down. And that's all part of the problems of there being too much consolidation and concentration of power, in particular into big tech companies, into how they're working. And that then all ties to other stuff we talk about all the time around their ability to access large amounts of data, to profile us based on those things. And so a way which sort of locks others out and provides less transparency, we don't think necessarily is the answer here. And we think also it's just part of a bigger picture around competition in general.
I think that it's legitimate to point fingers at CrowdStrike, but you could still point some fingers at Microsoft around sandboxing of stuff that is executing even within the kernel.
Can you explain what sandboxing is?
Sandboxing is the process of running code within an environment where it gets the inputs and outputs as though it was running on the native system, but it's actually running inside a little container so that if things go wrong, it doesn't actually affect the whole system. But this bit of code took the entire system offline without any kind of remote level of recovery, had to require hands-on recovery, suggests that there's a defect there even within Windows, regardless of whether you want to say, well, CrowdStrike shouldn't have pushed their update anyway. There's other factors in play.
This was the poor IT bots who had to run around physically to every device affected in the aftermath, right? Yeah. There were employees, everything's down, people going, well, we can't do anything because we can't work. And part of that as well because of the digitization of so many different services. And so people have become reliant on their devices, on their computer systems to be doing everything. So, we saw images of signs up in shops saying, sorry, can't take any payment because our tills are down, or people who are, potentially would have been able to do things otherwise through other means, but weren't able to do so. And we see, I guess, kind of similar things in other areas where there's a move over towards digital only services. So it might be in healthcare where people are required to sort of access through digital means. It might be through identification where people are moving over toward digital ID rather than old school paper or card IDs. Now that move over doesn't have to be a bad thing, but it can be problematic if people are then forced to move over to those systems. So keeping other more tried and tested, more manual systems live might be what lots of people want or need or are used to or want to be using for all sorts of different reasons. Whereas if you move over to these sorts of things, then everything's broken, everything goes down. It's a lack of robustness to the system as a whole.
I want to pick up and throw it to Chris as one of our resident computer security experts. And I use all those terms very lightly in the sense that...
He's resident, he's here.
Yes, he is resident. But computers and security and expert, like none of those things are real. And I'm curious how you feel, Chris, because you are like the person I go to for all these things. So I make fun of the fact that you'd be the first to say that you're not an expert because the field is vast. And you and our colleague Ed, who's been a guest on this podcast before when we were talking about that other hack that Caitlin was referring to, you both like to refer to the world that Tom's referring to, this digital world, this glossy, attractive digital world that is the future for everybody, is held together with sticky plaster and duct tape.
And hopes and dreams.
Hopes and dreams. And with this example of CrowdStrike, of course, being an instantiation of that, where everything went wrong, is this fixable? Or is the world always going to be a little fragile with digital infrastructure because you can't have a world with 8,000 different operating systems. You can't have a world with federated intranet and all those things. And so it's either we have to get used to this or it can be perfected, or it is Tom's solution, which is we need to be resilient by not relying on these systems for everything.
That's a deep question. I think you need to have backup solutions to anything you're working on to some extent. I mean, PI as an instantiation of if we didn't have X service, how would we continue to function as an organization? If we don't have Y functionality, what would we do instead, etc., etc.? I think there will always be a centralization of various technical systems because the expertise also needs to be somewhat centralized. If everyone had a slightly arcane system, then as someone who works in the technical world, someone who does an IT related job, at the moment you realistically only have to know a little bit about Microsoft systems, a little bit about Linux, and a little bit about Mac to be able to do work in most companies. I mean, almost all companies have some archaicness to their systems, but broadly, to do 60+% of your job, so you just need to have a little bit of expertise in all of those major operating systems, at least for a day-to-day IT role.
What I love is that you're both getting to a very pragmatic view of the world, which is if you talk to a politician, they'll say, oh, AI is perfectible, the internet, all these systems are perfectible, and this was a failure. But in reality, we have to be ready for these failures. And the very ecosystem that generated this failure isn't something we can design ourselves out of, because as Chris, you say, there can only be so many types of systems. And that makes us vulnerable equally. And so we are reliant on the Microsofts of the world running these processes. We're reliant on the CrowdStrikes of the world not screwing things up. And yet these types of problems are going to just occur, aren't they? And whether it's a large company like Microsoft being the root of it, or open source, an application that everybody takes for granted, like a zip archive utility, can cause everything to come crashing down. And then we get into hardware, and hardware is a whole different level of pain. And so just to rephrase my question to you, Chris, what is the world we should be designing? Should we be designing one that we try to perfect, or we should design one that is resilient through being, I guess, this pragmatic?
I think an analogy may actually be useful here. So railways have existed for over 150 years. We know how railways work. We know how to run trains on railways. That doesn't stop there not being delays. That doesn't stop there being cancellations. That doesn't stop replacement bus services. There are a myriad of reasons why railways can't operate, be it everything from leaves on the line to cars hitting bridges, whatever it is. And the internet and the infrastructure around that, functions on it, be it operating systems or otherwise, is similarly susceptible to congestion, delays, cancellation, whatever. I think the real thing that changes between those two, though, is that a railway delay or problem is localized, whereas something that happens at the level of CrowdStrike or at the level of Microsoft can happen so quickly and spread around the entire globe and affect so many people and organizations almost simultaneously that it's a different level of harm's probably not the right word, but it just happens so much quicker that it feels much more viscerally like this is a failure and it's wrong. As you were saying about a politician would look at this in a different way because they wouldn't see that, there's other systems that exist because those systems, when they fail, are localized, whereas this is international and it's unresolvable without, specialist assistance or whatever.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to stop mistakes happening or people doing stupid things or dangerous things, right? I think any system which relies on eliminating those entirely isn't going to work. So instead, then it's about making sure that the systems we have are resilient and robust. And in my opinion, things which are transparent and things which have diversity are more likely to be resilient and robust. So no, we're not going to solve all problems and remove them all. But if we put ourselves in a position where we're better able to deal with them, especially when they are these really big and wide-ranging problems, that's got to be a good thing.
Although earlier in this podcast I blamed it on the lawyers, I was outraged when I saw the claims that this was the fault of competition law. This was the fault that Microsoft was being forced to give kernel-level access. It was such a quick and convenient and easy solution to blame that. Now, what we're dealing with 6 months later is another version of that competition line, which is, we've heard recently, Mark Zuckerberg, who's complaining about a lot of things lately. He has been complaining that Apple is locking them out of the stack. And that's not fair. We want to have access. And we've heard Apple articulating that it's similar to Microsoft. We can't give access to this because things will be bad. But in Apple's example, they're saying this is bad for security and privacy. And so you have this argument from both these tech giants, Microsoft and Apple, that they need to maintain control in order to maintain integrity of the system. And then you have, poor struggling companies like Meta saying, oh, we're being locked out. CrowdStrike rightly would have said, oh, we're being locked out, and it's not fair. What's the answer?
It's probably worth saying that, a lot of Meta's stuff is functionally, in a lot of respects, malware. If you think about what it does. So I don't know if that's the universal example.
Yeah, and while our lawyers listening to this might want us to cut what Caitlin just said, it's important to remember that Meta, or Facebook back in the day, was the one who took a VPN and bought the VPN service and then used it in a way to identify people's traffic on the internet. So they took a service that was designed for security and turned it upside down, essentially, to their advantage. And they did the same thing with two-factor authentication, with the use of mobile phones. And so it's not exactly a company that has exhibited trustworthy behaviors. But, while we can pick on Meta, it could be another company that is trying to do something good in the world. I know it's kind of funny to think about that right now when we had the billionaires at the Trump inauguration. But yeah, what is the world we have to get used to living with? Is it one that is increasingly digitized and will fail periodically? Is increasingly digitized and will have giants who control access for fear of everything coming down? or a world that is going to have to learn to be resilient with redundant systems and failing well, but that's expensive.
Again, the best way I can pull this back is to PI's own lived experience. Is I think our belief that systems can run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year without failure would be misguided. I think all systems will ultimately have a fail condition in them. I think Apple and Microsoft do have a point. The less people you let in to somewhere, the less chance one of those people is going to be doing something malicious or naughty. However, that also doesn't mean that Apple or Microsoft own all of the best engineers or all of the best technologies. Someone might come along and go, look, you guys have been doing a very, archaic way, or sticking with CrowdStrike. So someone might come along and be like, well, your arcane way of, having a database of indicators of compromise or malware or whatever, having a big directory is not a very effective way. We have a different way of doing it that can live tell whether something's a malware because of the way it exhibits a behavior that your system doesn't permit, it has no capacity to do. And, to block that out of the market is equally as, as damaging, I guess, to some extent.
It's, I guess, worth saying that just because, say Apple and Microsoft are right, and if what they're saying is trust us, if you're the only people you allowed in the house, we're not going to steal everything. But we've also, PI's lived experience, know that that's not true. There are lots of companies who would like to be closed wall, closed gardens, whose entire purpose is to take kind of an inventory of everything in your house. And okay, this is getting an increasingly torturous metaphor, but it's not just trust us, we're not going to do damage. It's trust us and trust that what we want to do aligns with what you want us to do. And I think those are two different things that are quite tricky. And part of what the competition thing and part of what the interoperability stuff and the transparency stuff is trying to do is balance the risk of more actors with the risk of who the actors otherwise would be and the incentives that they have from trying to make as much money as possible.
I think you also touched on a point that's really close to PI's heart, which is if you centralize around someone like Microsoft, who is a US company who has been repeatedly pushed on by intelligence services, then you're centralizing that control as well, not just the control.
You're picking which intelligence service you prefer your data to get.
You always are to some extent.
Yeah. If you're going to pick one, I'm not sure you'd pick the CIA.
Or the NSA.
Or the NSA, based on history. I don't know who you'd pick, but...
And it means that if you assume you removed that kernel access for anyone but Microsoft, then what happens in the kernel is entirely a black box. Like, it's relatively a black box at the moment, but at least people have a CrowdStrike or another threat analysis company can at least try and analyze what's going around, whether malicious activity is taking place, whether stuff looks not quite right. Whereas if it's entirely a black box, you will never know if it's right or not right.
Well, I guess you'll only know when you get screwed.
And knocked on the door.
Yeah.
After this CrowdStrike example has hit everybody, I think if you are an organization that does not have the resiliency plans, the recovery plans, the backup plans, because it's cheaper not to, or it's because you're more agile an organization because you don't have to have these procedures and the staff to manage it, then you're not a real organization. You're not a real company. You're not providing a real service. And this is the world we have to get ready for as we become more reliant, but also in a world that is more conflict-oriented, where there will be more advantage in those governments to have the capacity to perpetrate these types of things. And as the tech sector becomes increasingly nationalistic, this is the world we're going to be navigating. And this is why I love working where I work and looking across at Chris right now. And I'm very fond of that fact because at PI, I sit across from him and we get to have these types of conversations all the time. Now, for many listeners and for many people out in the world, it's easy to presume that because we're a privacy organization, we're Luddites. We oppose technology. And it's easy to assume that when we're criticizing a case like CrowdStrike, we're talking about bad tech companies doing bad techie things as they try to embed tech more and more in our lives. But it's not that at all. We love these things as much as we hate them. And we love navigating these difficult decisions that need to be made in order to build a world that has this technology and is resilient and can survive what's to come.
It's also worth noting that it's tech companies, but it's also lawmakers. And if you're a legislator and you're creating a requirement, for example, for a digital ID system, in which you're expecting people to, maybe when they present at hospitals to show their digital ID, maybe when they get stopped in the street to show their digital ID, you've really got to ask yourself, am I building a system in which if there is some significant problem, I am causing chaos?
Setting up a system to fail.
Setting up a system which will fail and will cause untold personal damage to individuals. And because techies are techies, and at least technical people try and look at technical solutions, legislators aren't. And sometimes some legislators have a tendency to think computer, magic, technical, brilliant, and that is not our perspective.
I think a number of people also take, especially from my area of work, people in a tech with a tech background think all things to some extent can be solved by tech. That clearly emails are superior to snail mail, or a VoIP call is superior to an analog call, and you can see why. You're talking about quality or integrity of the data or whatever. But there are, as you point out, when you get move things like digital ID, it's the reason that a plastic card works so well as an ID system, for driving licenses and things, is, the data might rub off over time, but functionally it's still readable by a human.
And there's an understanding that people lose them. The UK is not a great example of talking about ID because we don't really have one. But if I lose my driving license and I get pulled over, then I have a certain period of time at which I need to present myself to a police station with my driving license, because I can lose my driving license. There's an understanding that happens. People are much less understanding about computer systems, just because of how they've developed. And I can't remember who the philosopher is, which is really annoying because it's someone famous. But there's the whole thing. You invent a plane. You also invent the plane crash. You invent an automatic update system. You invent a problem with an automatic update system. The thing that will break it comes wrapped into the thing that it is. There's no way of having a plane that doesn't have the potential for a plane crash, because that's not how life works. And people forget that that's true of computer systems.
Yeah. And going back to what you were saying about resilience, like if Slack stops working and your business also stops working, then something is
Wrong.
Systemically wrong in how you've configured your business.
Thanks for listening. You can sign up to be the first to learn more about our work at pvcy.org/podsignup. And we'll include some links to relevant articles and information in the description wherever you're listening, or on our website at pvcy.org/techpill. Don't forget to rate and subscribe to the podcast on whichever platform you use. The music is courtesy of Sepia. This podcast was produced by Max Burnell for Privacy International.